Guys, look at the freaking roof line. Look at the crime against nature that is this roof line. Ew! Okay, so, when you look at fancy houses in other places, and this is something, okay, for all of the people who are like, oh, America's gross, Americans are stupid, American bread is cake, you're wrong, and I'll debunk each of those things if I need to, when I need to. America is fine. America's fine. But we do have this one really, really big problem, which is no respect for symmetry in architecture for houses. It is a real problem, right? If you look at like a grand old manor in Europe, you will notice that there is some symmetry, right? The roof line is similar on both sides, right? If you follow the line of the roof with your eyes, it makes sense. It's visually balanced, right? American bread is cake, that's nice. Listen, you can buy... Okay. So, the preservation methods available in Europe were mostly salt, because Europe has much less land mass without access to salt water, right? And a lot of land mass with access to salt water. Now, America, much more sparsely populated, so a little bit harder to trade along, right? And much more landlocked land area, right? And at the same time, a ton of very, very sugary plants, like a ton of root vegetables that just store a lot of sugar, right? And a ton of trees that are very, very easy to get basically sugar from, right? So, if you're in Europe and you're trying to preserve your food without refrigeration, you are going to use salt to do it, right? Which is why there's so much salt-cured food there. And if you're in America, sometimes you will use salt. Jerky is an American food, classically, and that is salt-cured, but it's also usually sugar-cured. Now, in America, mostly, sugar is used for curing, preferentially over salt. So, if you're an American and you go to Europe, you're gonna find that things taste surprisingly salty. The palate is just a little bit different, and if you are in Europe and you go to America, you're gonna find that things taste a little bit surprisingly sweet. The palate is just different, right? So, if you are tasting traditional American foods, especially traditional American foods in places where, that were settled longer ago, right? Like Boston, etc., you're gonna find a lot of molasses in the traditional cuisine, right? Brown bread is a kind of canned bread that is very, very sweet, but it is as a preservative, right? And you should understand that the way this was consumed wasn't the way that bread was consumed in Europe, right? When you are looking at the way that bread was consumed in Europe, you are looking at a staple of the diet, right? Places in Europe where people would just eat bread for lunch. This isn't bread like we know it today. It wasn't really refined bread. There were often a lot of other seeds, etc. in this bread. There was more nutrition available in this bread, but it was still bread for lunch. This was never the way that Americans were eating. Americans have always had a diet that was heavier on meat. All the pickled foods you enjoy. Yes. I mean, that's one way of preserving things with salt, right? When you look at European pickling techniques, right, you're gonna see a lot more salt, and when you look at American pickling techniques, you're gonna see sweeter pickles, right? They're still obviously salt cured, but you're gonna see sweeter pickles, right? It's just a different flavor profile. And there's nothing inherently wrong with it, right? People have this idea like, sugar is the devil, sugar is addictive. People had the same thoughts about salt. When you look into the research on it, it is not that compelling. The research on, like, rats will get addicted to sugar the way they get addicted to cocaine, if you actually read that study, that is not what that study says. Go actually read studies, I'm begging you. I would not recommend eating an amount of sugar that makes you ill. Obviously, there is too much sugar, and it's possible, I would be convincible, that the traditional American diet has too much sugar, or that the traditional European diet has too much salt for most people. Again, these things vary from person to person. But also, the way that you eat day to day has very little to do with the way that you eat on special occasions, right? So if you're eating like the traditional cuisine of your culture, on occasion, you don't really have to worry about whether that is like healthier or less healthy. Brown bread is fine to enjoy frequently. It is like cake, you know? Whatever, man. Have cake. So the whole American bread is cake thing comes from the fact that Americans have a sweeter palate overall, and from the fact that we have a bit of a different relationship with bread. Bread is for a slightly different purpose, right? And so we have a range of breads. We have some breads that are for sandwiches, and those are basically like European bread. The other thing is that we have much stricter rules, at least for now, God bless, about labeling foods, right? So if you use a tiny amount of something, to clean your machinery, you still have to put that on your ingredients, whereas you don't in Europe, right? And there are some things that you can put in tiny, tiny quantities that you still have to say in the US and not in Europe. And furthermore, we have rules about enriching flour, right? We had issues with malnutrition on a broad scale, so we made laws that certain kinds of products, including bread products, have to be enriched with certain vitamins. But yeah, no, when you look at the ingredient list, you'll see many more ingredients on American bread than European bread. And again, we have different breads for different purposes, right? So we have breads that are very much like European bread, right? Very simple breads that you wouldn't really, that you would eat with something, right? And then we have other breads which are almost a little bit sweet, right? That we use for like a kid's treat, right? Like Wonder Bread. Very few people would eat Wonder Bread for like a ham sandwich. Wonder Bread is largely for like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, right? But yeah, no, the idea that Americans are eating just sugar bread all the time, that's crazy. That's crazy. That comes from a place of not really understanding the different cuisines are different, and that the same food might serve a different role in a different cuisine, and therefore might be seasoned or flavored differently, right? Anyway,